Hey everyone, I hope you all are doing well. This time I would like to talk about the fourth round of the Manufacturers Cup World Series 2025, which takes place at the legendary Spa circuit. Obviously with the Group 3 cars for the Manufacturers Cup. As for the tire compounds, we'll be using the medium tires alongside the intermediates in the wet tire compound only, and we only have to lap the circuit 20 times. And you can already see here from the setting here that the qualifying session itself is only going to last for 4 minutes, as one lap pretty much lasts slightly above or like slightly more than 2 minutes. That means that everybody only has one chance to set the final qualifying lap. So the qualifying session is going to be really interesting. The slipstream being used for this race is also set to realistic. And you can also see at the bottom of the screen there that all of us have to do a mandatory pit stop in this race. So even like I'm going to talk about the weather setting in a bit, because the weather setting being used for this race is set to random, where rain might appear. Unfortunately in this video I don't really have any footage of any rain or like wet driving. However, we've done this race like in wet conditions quite recently, so I will also share the link of the previous video down below, and you can also analyze the wet lines from there. But as for this race here, I mean, the tire wear multiplier being used for both the qualifying as well as for the race is set to ×3, and the fuel consumption is set to ×2 for the race, with a refueling speed of 7 liters per second. So all of us have to go into the pits anyway due to the lack of fuel. Like, it's not going to last till the end of the race. But on the very same time, I would like to talk about the weather setting, the track limit penalties at the circuit, like those ones where you can easily get a track limit penalty. I also would like to talk about the track, showing my best lap, and lastly showing a race simulation in the end. Once you enter the time trial session for the fourth round of the Manufacturers Cup, you will notice a certain wind speed and wind direction being shown just right below the circuit on the left hand side. And it also corresponds with the one if you join the track. However, once you leave the track, and if you have a look on the wind speed and the wind direction once again, you can notice that both of these parameters alongside the weather radar, which is also shown down below, have been changed. So that tells us that the weather setting being used for this round is completely random, so anything is possible in this race. Like on the previous videos, I would like to talk about the track by driving really slowly. So before you start your qualifying lap, you should try to place your car on the right hand side as much as possible, in order to carry as much speed as you can before starting your qualifying lap. And the braking point into turn 1, for me personally at least, it was always just right after the 100 braking marker on the left hand side. Obviously it also depends on the braking capability of your car, as well as the amount of speed you carry before heading into turn 1. But as for turn 1 itself, you should also try to use the inside curb, not the green area, but just the the color pattern curb as much as possible, so that you can try to rotate your car quite well, and thus also try to put the power down as early as you can. Because even though the Eau Rouge is also a corner technically, like here you would also try to use the inside curb as much as you can, but you should also try to be careful not to cut this curb on the left hand side, because that's one of those corners where you can easily get a track limit penalty. But the exit of turn 1 is quite important, because you can end up losing or gaining a lot of time before starting sector 2. And for me personally, the braking point for into the first corner of sector 2 was just right after the 100 braking mark on the left hand side. However, the first right hand on sector 2 is quite tricky, because obviously you should try to cut that inside curb as much as you can, but you can also see these bollards being placed there, right? For yourself, please do not use them, because if you use them, something like this can happen. Like, it can unsettle your car, or like in that instance here, like for the first corner of sector 2, there's also a possibility where your car might be able to jump around or like jump into the air, I mean. So because of that, try to be careful not to use these bollards for the qualifying, but also for the race. But here you should also try to use the inside curb as much as you can. Like, it's really tricky because on one hand you're not really allowed to use the bollards, but on the same time you should still try to use the inside curb as much as you can, right? So it's a bit tricky. So for this corner here, it's also quite important to use the apex as much as possible in order to minimize the track distance. And unlike and also the same case here before, like for the left hand side, like where there were also those two bollards being placed there, you should also try not to use these bollards, but also try to use the curb on the same time, if you know what I mean. I think once I will show my best lap afterwards, you might be able to visualize that a little bit better for yourself. And as for the braking point into that corner, for me personally was always just right before the curb started to be shown. Not really to be shown, but where your car started to be even on the curb on the left hand side. But here it's also really important to use the apex as much as you can, but also at the very same time trying not to use the bollards on the same time, because they can, not really can, but they will unsettle your car. This corner is also a bit tricky depending on how much downforce your car has. Cars such as the BMW, for example, they might be able to take that corner flat out, but for other cars such as the Corvette or even in my case here, I have to lift a little bit. But it also depends on the wind speed, because if you have tailwind, it's not really that ideal, but if you have headwind, that's a little bit better. The braking point into the final corner was just right between the 100 and the 150 meter point on the left hand side. And once again, you should also try to cut these corners as much as possible, but you also have to be careful here, because once you cut these corners a lot, then your car might also unsettle a little bit here. Like, it was really noticeable with the MR cars, but with the FR cars it was a little bit more stable. And here this is a demonstration how, let's say, a qualifying lap might look like. I mean, this was also my best lap. So yeah, I will just leave you guys watching this clip here, and then I will also catch you guys later on when I will talk about the track limit penalties. the first example I would like to show you all is actually something which might happen quite often once the track is wet. Because once the track is wet, you will like to use the wet line through this section here, but if you cut the left hander of that corner a little bit too much, then you will receive a half a second penalty for that, like the first left hander before heading into Eau Rouge. But on the very same time, I mean, this might have happened to all of you at least once, I believe. You can also receive a track limit penalty for the final left-hander here if you cut it a little bit too much. And the final example I would like to show you all is actually a track limit penalty in Sector 3, because if you place your car a little bit too much on the right-hand side here before turning to the left, then you will also receive a half a second track limit penalty. So watch out for that. As for the race simulation, I was using the custom race mode from the World Circuits once again. So I was also racing against the normal AI. Like around that time, I also saw that there was the Sofa AI for Spa as well. But unfortunately, the Spa AI is not really able to drive on the wets yet. So I was forced to use the normal AI instead. But there's also something I can spoil it for you all already. Because I also would like to explain the whole situation a little bit. Like towards the end of the race, you will be able to see the insane pace of the AI. Because what I have to tell you is that all of the AI were using the hard tire compound. The tire wear towards the end of the race was also quite bad. But on the very same time, they were able to do 16.1 in the race trim. At the moment, that's quicker than Volt records right now. So yeah, this is something I just wanted to explain to you already, because the boost has been set to off once again, as usual, because you can already see here that I was able to open up the gap quite a lot. But I believe once you reach a certain gap, then the AI will just automatically turn on the boost in order to close the gap to you once again. It's a bit annoying, but also fun on the same time if you see those lap times being driven by the AI, especially on the hard tire compound, where on the same time we have to use the medium tires instead, right? But as for the race here, I tried to use the the rain setting as well. So in terms of the weather setting, I was also trying to have a look what the GT engine website was saying, and I think their website said, or like showed at least, that we oh my god, I cannot even speak English anymore, I'm sorry. So that the weather setting being used at the beginning should be CO2, I believe, and throughout the middle of the race, or like in the middle of the race, that we should be using RO3 setting. So this is pretty much the rain setting free from the weather settings, at least. So I was using that, but unfortunately in this very race here, it didn't rain, unfortunately. It was really close, the weather clouds, right? They got so close of hitting the track, but unfortunately they missed it all the time. So in this race here, it's a dry race, unfortunately, but as I talked about it on the previous section before, like when I was talking about the weather, it's a bit similar to the first round of the Manufacturers Cup we've had in this year, because even there, the weather setting being used for both the time trial session but also for the race was set to random. Only the qualifying session was set to preset, so I suspect the qualifying session being the same for this round at least. However, we don't know whether it's going to rain in the race even, or if there's going to be rain. Yeah, it's like the other option being left, right? But if it's not going to rain, then I can maybe show you a guide, as you can see here, because it was completely full dry, unfortunately. And I wasn't even using the optimal strategy either, because I was trying to extend my stand as long as possible after seeing those weather clouds, because I didn't want to pit twice in this race. But as we have to do a mandatory pit stop anyway, and especially our fuel consumption not being able to reach with one tank till the end of the race, that meant that we had to go into the pits anyway in order to refuel at least. And with the tire wear multiplier being set to ×3, it also meant that we had to go into the pits anyway in order to change our tires. But if it's going to be a dry race, then I suspect the optimal strategy being like around 9-11-ish, because you also have to remember that you start the race with full fuel, and that means that you also carry a lot of weight with you, like by driving at the circuit. And it's also a high-speed circuit as well. So if you drive the first 9 laps, or like if your first stint is 9 laps only, then you go into the pits in order to in order to finish the race with the 11 laps remaining. No, wait a minute. What am I even talking about? Like if you try to finish the last 11 laps, right, with a new set of tires and also by refueling a bit, that means that it should also help your tires a little bit here. It's not really the optimal probably, even though I said that potentially the optimal strategy might be 9-11, like the first stint being 9 laps and the second stint being 11 laps. But you can also do, and I think this is like the safest strategy, to do 10-10 instead. So that your first strategy being on 10 laps and you also finish the race with the other 10 laps remaining. So I think it really depends on your race situation, because you also have to keep in mind that the slipstream being used for this race is set to realistic. So I'm not really sure how easily it is for you all to follow the cars in front of you, especially through Puhor, like through this corner here. I potentially pronounced that word incorrectly, and if I did, I apologize for that. But it's really difficult to follow the cars in front of you, especially through the mid to high speed, or like especially to the through the high speed corners. And you're also about to see here, because obviously it also depends on the wind direction, because if the wind is if you have headwind through that corner, then you can you will have an easier time taking the fast right-hander here flat out. But on the very same time, if you have a car in front of you, then due to the dirty air, it will be a little bit difficult to follow the car in front of you. But I think, no, what is it? The racing, or the what is it? Yeah, what kind of weather setting will be used for the race itself, right? This is going to be interesting. So as the race will start tomorrow anyway, I will also try to watch them, obviously. But if it's going to be the same as the Nürburgring race we've had before, because you also have to keep in mind the qualifying session only lasts for 4 minutes. So that means that all of the drivers have a one shot anyway. And if it was going to rain, then I'm not quite sure if there would be anybody being able to set a qualifying lap as well. Because unfortunately not all the drivers leave the pit on the very same time. So there will be a few drivers being left on the pit lane just waiting for the turn to join the track. But till they are able to join the track, some time will also be gone in the meantime. So for example, you start the qualifying session with 4 minutes and you're desperately trying to join the track, but you cannot do it for whatever reason. But once you're able to join the track, and you only have like 3.5 minutes left, or maybe even 3 minutes left, I don't know. So it's going to be interesting. So my theory is that the qualifying session is going to be dry only, but only that the race weather setting itself will be set to completely random. So yeah, anything's possible, but as I said it before, like at the very beginning of this video, I will also try to share the link from the previous Spa race I've done here. At that time I was racing for Peugeot still, but you should be able to see there how the wet weather was like. Especially, I think it's also a really good example, because we started the race on dry conditions, and only towards the end of the race, or like towards the middle of the race, it started to rain till the end of the race. And this way you're also able to see at what time you should be able to use the wet line instead compared to the dry line, because obviously if it starts to rain, then you can still use the dry line at the beginning, but at some point you have to shift the racing line, like going from the dry line onto the wet line for these kind of conditions. And I think the Peugeot race I've done at that time shows it quite well. And you can also see in terms of the weather radar that it was quite, yeah, rainy, if I can say that. Like we've had lots of dark blue clouds even. I think at the beginning the clouds were like still in, what is it, like normal bluish. And we also didn't really know at that time how good the wet tires were going to be, or like even the intermediates. So this way I chose the intermediates at that time. I think during, like in the middle of the race, you could have maybe chosen the wets, but I'm not quite sure about that one, because at the end of the race it was better to be on the intermediates potentially. But I might be sharing misinformation here. If that's the case, I apologize for that. But anyway, I think I will share the link of the Peugeot Spa race I've done earlier there, so that you can also analyze the weather line. I think it's a really good example. But in this case here, this is a dry race, unfortunately. But you can also see here down below that with the fuel consumption I've had with the Citroen, it was never going to last till the end of the race. But regarding fuel consumption, like in order how to save even more fuel, this is also something I can try to give away to you all. And this is also, like, for me personally, like a little help. Like whenever we have to save fuel for a mid-speed track, or like for a low-speed track, I think it's always more beneficial to save more fuel for those kind of tracks. However, for the high-speed circuits, such as Spa, Monza, I think you can also count Bathurst there in terms of the fuel saving, but also for Saint-Croix. It's always better to rather, not really to go flat out obviously, but just try to short shift a tiny bit there, because if you try to save fuel a lot at these circuits, you will just end up losing a lot of lap time, and you will also lose a lot of time on the straights alone. So because of that, if you really want to save fuel, and maybe you can try to do it if you have a car in front of you, because you can use the driver in front of you, like for the straights at least, or with the slipstream I mean, that you can save fuel instead. So towards the end of the straight line, for example, you can also try to play around with the fuel map, or you can also try to lift and coast before braking into the following corner. These are all the things you can do, obviously. But obviously on the very same time, as you cannot really practice that kind of fuel saving, because you don't really know at what time you will be having that driver in front of you, where like who gives you the possibility and the opportunity to save fuel even. So this is something you cannot really practice unless you have like a friend of yours and you really would like to practice just for that one specific case. Then obviously you can do that. But if you do it spontaneously, then you also have to take that into account when trying to refuel for the final stint. Because if you refuel in the first stint, then obviously the laps remaining down below, like which you can also see down below for the fuel map, is also going to adjust and update itself all the time. But if you go into the pits and only refuel for the last 10 laps, I mean, so for example, you go into the pits at the end of lap 10 and you saved a lot of fuel behind another driver in front of you, but unfortunately you won't be having the driver in front of you anymore for the second stint, and you're still like, oh okay, I only have to drive for another 10 laps in order to finish the race, so let's just refuel 10 laps. If you do that, then you can only finish the race with the same amount of driving style you've done on the first stint. So this is something you really have to watch out for, because some drivers can easily do a mistake while doing so, and they also end up running out of fuel and not being able to finish the race because of that. So if you do that, and decide to go into the pits in order to finish the race without having any driver in front of you, then I just want to say it before anybody does the mistake. Just try to refuel a little bit more. So in that case, I would maybe suggest around 1.5 up to 2 laps more of fuel, so that you can also be a bit of in the safer side. Obviously, the more you have to refuel, the more you're going to lose in the pits, but it's going to be beneficial overall because you're going to gain all the lost time on your stint back again, because you are able to drive a little bit faster on the straight line instead, right? So this is something you have to watch out for. But otherwise, I think this race is pretty straightforward if it's a dry race only. But if we have a weather race, then yeah, yeah, you're able to see the mistake I've done here, which I've also shown on the previous section of this video here. But otherwise, if it's going to rain, then you also should watch out and look after the weather radar before starting the race. That's truly important. And next to that, I think that's mainly it. So hopefully I was able to cover everything up once again. If I didn't, then please ask your questions on the comment section down below, so that I can also try to answer them as quickly as I can, obviously before you guys will be having the races tomorrow. But on the very same time, I would like to thank you all for the support once again. And furthermore, I also would like to wish you all the best for the Manufacturers Cup race tomorrow. We've already done 50% of the Manufacturers Cup season. It's actually quite insane how quickly, or like how fast the time yeah, flew by in the end. But moreover, it's still like another 3 rounds to go. Like with Spa, I think the next round is going to be Sardinia, a reverse, and the last round being Suzuka. With Suzuka, I also don't really know if there's going to be a dynamic weather or not, because this track also offers rain or like dynamic weather. Personally, I doubt it, because with this race here, we would already have 2 dynamic races. If it's free, then it would be pretty interesting. But yeah, but I think that's mainly it from my side, because yeah, sorry that I'm not really able to talk quite well in this video. But nevertheless, I would like to wish you all the best for tomorrow, and hopefully all of you will be able to have some good races. All of you being able to achieve your goals, so that we can also see some good racing tomorrow, also some clean races. Not clean races, clean racing, I mean. And hopefully I'll be able to see you guys on the next video. So until then, have a nice weekend everyone, stay safe, and cheers!